Opponents of abortion have managed to capture for themselves what really is a most enviable debater's position. We're the right to lifers, they say. We do no more than defend for every human being what every human being surely has, the right to life. You enter the ring with them and you carry a handicap. You look a bit grubby. It's embarrassing to find yourself arguing with people who say they do no more than insist impartially and cleanly that every human being has a right to life. For surely every human being does have this right, so aren't you being rather grubby in arguing with them? Well, many of us do feel that women have a moral right to abortions and ought to be left secure in their legal right to them, so we do enter the ring. We say in our school-marmish way, but you know, it isn't obvious that killing, anyway, a 3-month-old fetus is killing a human being. No doubt it's killing something which will become a human being if left to fend for itself quietly. But what makes you think it's a human being now? And if it isn't, then what's the relevance to, anyway, a first trimester abortion of the fact that every human being has a right to life? They then respond in an awfully familiar way. They take out those ghastly enlarged photographs I'm sure you've all seen of bits of fetuses after operations, and so it goes. You say, but what do those photographs establish? It doesn't follow from the fact that a thing is like a human infant in the way those photographs indicate that it is a human infant, and so on and on and on. I don't really mean to poke fun at this response to the right to lifers. I'm sure it's the right response to start with. I'm sure a fetus isn't a human being, and that there therefore are things you can do to a fetus which you can't do to a human being. But I don't in fact propose to argue for that this evening. What I'd like to do instead is to raise a more general issue. It's an issue which obviously has a direct bearing on the question whether or not abortion ought to be permitted, but it also has a direct bearing on a number of equally important moral problems, such as, for example, the problem which capital punishment raises, and the problem about whether euthanasia ought to be permitted, and if so, what kind or kinds of euthanasia, because as we all know, there are differences. Indeed, it bears even on the question what precisely is the source of the duty we feel to provide this or that kind of foreign aid. The issue I have in mind is the issue, just what is the right to life we all think we all have? What do you have in having a right to life? I'm inclined to think that to have a right to life is to have a whole cluster of rights. So far, so good. But what rights are in the cluster? Let's begin with a distinction. Let's say that a negative right is a right to not have this or that done. Thus, each of us, I take it, has a right to not be punched in the left eye within the next hour. I think every one of you has that right. In having that right, you have a negative right to not have something done. You have a right that something shall not be done to you. Let's say that a positive right is a right to have something done, this or that, whatever it might be. I don't know about you, but I have a right to have my bathroom ceiling painted tomorrow morning because I paid a man to do it, and he promised that he would. So I have a certain quite particular right to have something done, and I'm sure each of you has comparable, similar, positive rights. Now, I think it plain that the right to life cluster of rights contains some negative rights. Well, which ones? How about, for starters, the right to not be killed? Opponents of abortion plainly think we have that right in having a right to life. Indeed, they rest their case on it. Well, let's have a look at it. If we do have this right in having a right to life, and if every human being has a right to life, how come there are so many kinds of cases in which it's perfectly permissible, morally speaking, to kill a human being? I think we tend to forget the immense variety here. Variety in the cases in which, morally speaking, it really is permissible to kill a human being. There's first the most obvious sort of case. There's killing in self-defense against an aggressor. If a man is driving a tank at you with every obvious intention of running you down, you can surely use your anti-tank gun on him. If the Belgians and the Germans are drifting across your border in tanks, you can use your anti-tank guns on them to defend yourselves, even at the cost, of course, of killing the drivers of the anti-tank guns, of the tanks. But there are lots of other kinds of cases in which you can kill a human being. There's, secondly, killing what Robert Nozick, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. There's killing what Robert Nozick calls innocent shields of aggressors. Suppose that a man driving his tank at you has taken the trouble to tie a baby on the front of the tank. The driver isn't innocent, he's an aggressor. But the baby's no aggressor. Yet you can surely use your anti-tank gun even though you kill both the aggressor and the baby. We'll call that case, that kind of case, a case in which an innocent shield of a threat is killed. I think it's plain enough why Nozick calls this kind of case a case in which there's an innocent shield of a threat or an aggression. There's third kind of case, killing what Nozick calls innocent threats. Suppose the driver of the tank has no villainous intentions. He's a quiet, friendly, mild sort of person who's been hypnotized into driving that tank north-northeast. And he simply doesn't see you there lying in his path. It's a pity. It's not his fault. But I think you can surely destroy the tank all the same, the tank being headed toward you after all. If we were going to concentrate on abortion this evening, I would want for us to look long and hard at cases of this third kind. It seems to me that killing an innocent threat in cases of this kind is very like certain cases of abortion, and that attending to the likeness would be very helpful in getting us to see that and why abortion, at least in some cases, really is morally acceptable. But I have a more general aim in view, that is the right to life itself, so let's go on. Let me first remind you, we have three kinds of cases in which it's morally permissible to kill. There's the killing of an aggressor in self-defense. There's the killing of an innocent shield of an aggressor. And there's the killing of an innocent threat. There's, fourth, a large batch of cases which I'll call trade-off cases. And while in some of those cases it would not be permissible to kill, in others it would. Let's have a case of the first kind in which it would, I hope, well, I'm not going to say what I think, we'll lay out the case, and I will then say I hope you would agree with me as to what's to be said. Imagine that you're a great transplant surgeon. You can transplant just about anything and do it successfully. You have 5 patients, 2 of whom need a lung each. That is, in the case of both of them, both of their lungs are going, and they only need 1 each. 2 of your patients need a kidney each. That is, both of them have both kidneys failing. You can get on with 1 kidney, so each of the 2 needs just 1 kidney. And the 5th needs a heart. If they don't get these parts, let's suppose, they'll all 5 of them die. Now, here's a young man who's just come into the clinic for his yearly checkup. He's a fine, healthy specimen, and lo and behold, he has just the right blood type to be of use. Can you cut him up and parcel out his parts to the 5 who need them? 5 lives for 1, after all. Well, I hope you'll agree that you can't do that. You must prefer letting your 5 patients die to cutting up the 1 who just came in for a checkup. All right, that's one trade-off case. Trade-off because the possibility here is gaining 5 lives for 1. But here's a second trade-off case. It's a case that's adapted from an article by Philippa Foot. There's an out-of-control trolley speeding down the track. It's out of control, speeding down the track, and on the track ahead are 5 track workmen. Let's suppose the sides of the track are steep and they can't get off the track quickly, whereas the trolley, in fact, is out of control and going very fast. Now, you're a bystander, but you know something about trolleys and about tracks. And in particular, you know you can throw the switch by the track, thereby turning the trolley off onto a spur of track on the right. That's all you can do, let's suppose. You can either do nothing, in which case the trolley will speed on into the 5, or you can turn the trolley onto the right-hand spur. Unfortunately, Mrs. Foot, whose case this is, has arranged for there to be 1 track workman on the right-hand track. And he can't get off in time either. So if you do nothing, 5 will die. If you turn the trolley, you'll kill 1. Can you turn the trolley? Most people say you can. You can throw the switch and turn the trolley to minimize the damage the trolley will do. Again, a trade-off case, 1 life for 5. Now, it's an extremely nice question, I think. What marks the difference between these two cases? Why is it that you can't cut up the man who comes in for the checkup and parcel out his parts to save 5, but you can turn the trolley, killing 1, to save 5? It's a nice problem, and I'm not about to give you an answer. I think it's a handsome problem. The only thing I can give you is a name for it. I call it the trolley problem, in honor of Mrs. Foot's lovely trolley case. Well, for our purposes, it's enough to notice that you can turn the trolley, thereby killing the 1 to save 5. And notice that one-track workman on the right-hand track isn't an aggressor, as in the case of the man who's driving his tank at you. He isn't an innocent shield of a threat. He isn't an innocent threat. He doesn't threaten anybody himself at all. Yet you can kill him all the same. So I think we have here a 4th distinct kind of case in which you really can, morally speaking, it's morally permissible to kill a human being. So then, what's to be said about that right to not be killed? We are all very fondly of the view that we all have a right to not be killed in having a right to life. And how's that to be squared with the fact that we can kill a human being in cases of the 4 kinds that I've indicated? One tends, I think, to suppose that the permissibility of killing in cases of the first kind, that is, where there's an aggressor, a villainous aggressor, that the permissibility of killing in such a case is easily explained. One supposes, that is, that you can kill an aggressor in self-defense, in that he has, by his aggression, forfeited his right to not be killed. This may be correct. I'm not absolutely sure, though, and I thought it paid to draw your attention to the source of the worry about accounting for the permissibility of killing in the first kind of case. The trouble that arises for accounting for this permissibility by appeal to forfeiture of a right. What I have in mind is this. The aggressor is going at you in a tank, and one thinks, yes, it's perfectly permissible. You can fire your anti-tank gun, destroy the tank, and destroy the aggressor, thereby destroying the aggressor. But suppose that just before you get to fire your anti-tank gun, the aggressor's tank stalls. Suppose the aggressor gets out to examine the engine, but falls and breaks both ankles in the process. Let's suppose you now have time to get away from the aggressor, and you're in no danger. I take it you won't think that you may, all the same, go ahead and kill him. I take it once he's broken both his ankles and is lying there moaning, you can't now aim your anti-tank gun at him and destroy him. But why not? If he had really forfeited his right to not be killed by virtue of his attack on you, why couldn't you go ahead and kill him? There are people, I don't know if we have any in the room, I lose track from state to state as to what state views on these matters are. There are people who think it's permissible for a state to impose death as a penalty on those who commit one or another very serious crime. I don't know what your state is doing about these matters nowadays. I see a head shaking no. Well, at all events, there are some who think that if your state isn't permitting it, your state ought to, and if your state is permitting it, all to the good. Now, why do they think it's permissible to do this? They no doubt take the view that what makes it permissible is the fact that one who commits a crime, at any rate a very serious crime, has forfeited his right to not be killed. That's what makes it permissible to kill him. But in the first place, I doubt that those who think of death as an acceptable penalty would think it an acceptable penalty for an unsuccessful attempt on the life of another. And it should be remembered that the aggressor in the case I just mentioned has just broken both his ankles and didn't succeed in his attempt. All he succeeded in was an, alas, unsuccessful, unfortunate attempt on your life. More important, even if it could be made out that it will be permissible after trial and conviction for an agent of the state to kill an aggressor, no agent of the state can kill him prior to trial and conviction, and you can't kill him at any time. Even if he aimed his attack on you, you aren't ever going to be able to kill him. I take it there's nobody in the room who is state executioner. You're all private citizens, and you aren't going to be able to kill him. So while it is, I suppose, open to those who regard death as an acceptable penalty for an aggressor's crime, to say that he will, after trial and conviction, have no right to not be killed by an agent of the state, he at any rate now, after he's broken both of his ankles, now has a right to not be killed by you. Indeed, a right to not be killed by anybody at all until trial and conviction, and thus now has a right to not be killed, in which case, has he forfeited his right to not be killed? It could be said that while you're launching an attack on somebody, your right to not be killed is forfeited, but that if you manage to break your ankles in the process, the right zips back and you suddenly have it again. One could say that, but it's not wholly satisfying. It's too easy to say, well, the right just zipped out of existence and then back in again. It seems ad hoc to say this as an explanation of why it is at one point permissible to kill him and at another point not. Well, just so much for the difficulty that I think does arise in dealing with the first, even the first kind of case in which it's permissible to kill a person. That first kind of case is a case in which there's an aggressor aiming at your life. We know it's permissible to kill him, and what I was raising was the question, what makes it so? Well, maybe the appeal to forfeiture of a right will work, maybe it won't. At all events, it certainly won't work in the other three kinds of cases I mentioned. If you're a trolley track workman, surely you haven't forfeited your right to not be killed when you set foot on the right-hand spur of track on a Wednesday afternoon. A baby certainly doesn't forfeit its right to not be killed when it gets strapped onto the front of a tank and becomes an innocent shield of a threat. So what's to be said? Why is it that we can kill in these cases and yet take ourselves, all of us, to have a right to life, and thereby take ourselves to have a right to not be killed? Now, one way to deal with these worries is just simply to give up. What I have in mind is that one might say, well, after all, nobody has a right to not be killed. That was just a mistake. All we really have is a right, very complicated, hyphenated right. I'm going to say it all quickly, and you're to hear hyphens in between all of the words I'm about to utter. All we have is a right to not be killed when we're not aggressors, and when we're not innocent shields of threats, and when we're not innocent threats, and when we're not standing on a trolley track in conditions in which the only way in which 5 can be saved is by turning a trolley onto us. That's the only right we've got in this realm of killing. None of us has a right to not be killed, period. All we have is this very much more complicated right, the hyphenated right I just read out to you. And that's why killing an aggressor, an innocent shield of a threat, an innocent threat, a trolley track workman who's standing on the right-hand track when there are 5 who can be saved by turning a trolley onto him, that's why doing those things is no violation of the right to life, because in having a right to life, we don't have a right that we shall not be killed in those circumstances. It's a move that I think many people are inclined to want to make in respect not merely of the right to not be killed, but in respect of rights generally. It seems to me an interesting mistake to take that line. One who takes that line shows that he has the idea that rights are, in a certain sense, absolute. I think it pays us. I've made a distinction between positive and negative rights. Let me ask you to accept one further terminological distinction. Suppose a man has a right that something or other shall be the case. Let's say he has a right that P, where P is some statement or other. And suppose we make P false. He had a right that P be true, and we make P false. So, for example, if his right is the right that he's not punched in the nose within the next half hour, we make that false. That is, we bring about that he is punched in the nose within the next half hour. Then I'll say we infringe his right. But I'll say we, in the sense I have in mind, is the view that every infringing of a right is a wrong act, and thus a violating of a right. Now, the view that rights are absolute, I think, is a relatively common view. That is, if somebody has a right that P and you bring about that not P, you haven't merely infringed his right, you've acted wrongly. You've violated his right. But I think it's wrong, and it's of interest to see that it is. That it is comes out in the following case. Suppose you're very rich, and you therefore own lots of steak, which you keep in a locked freezer on your back porch. Here's a child. I've got a child in hand with a terrible protein deficiency. He's going to die if I don't get some protein into him fast. I haven't got any protein to give him. I don't know where to get any, other than from your locked freezer on your back porch. Let's suppose I try to get permission from you to take some, but you're out of town, so I can't reach you. Can I go ahead and break into the freezer? Most people, I think, would say yes. It's a child's life at stake, and they'd say, yes, you can go in. How can that be permissible? Don't you own the steak? By hypothesis, you own the steak, you own the freezer, you own the back porch. How can it be permissible for me to break in and walk away with a steak? If anyone thinks that rights are absolute, he's committed to saying that you don't, after all, have a right that people won't break into that freezer, on the ground that I don't act wrongly if I do so. If you think rights are absolute, you think I would act wrongly if I did so if you had the right. I don't act wrongly, so it must follow you don't have the right. Of course, you could take the view that rights are absolute and insist, of course, that you don't have a right that I won't break into the freezer, and yet say you have some right in this area. You could say you have a right to not have your freezer broken into except when somebody has a child in hand with a terrible protein deficiency who needs a steak and can't get one in any other way. You could say, that's all the right you have. And since I do have in hand a child with a terrible protein deficiency and I can't get steak in any other way, that's why it's all right that I break in. I don't violate or even infringe any right of yours. But I think that's a wrong move. Surely you do have a right that people simply will not break in and take a steak. And what shows this is that if I do break in, I have to compensate you later for having done so. And surely I do have to compensate you. I have to pay for the damage I caused to the freezer, and I have to replace or pay you for the steak that I take. I think that point's important. If all you had was a right that I not break into the freezer when I don't have a starving child who needs a steak, then since I did have a starving child, I would have done nothing you had a right I not do, and so no compensation would be owing. The fact that compensation is owing shows, and it seems to me shows conclusively, that I did do something you had a right that I not do. How are we to square this fact with the fact that I didn't act wrongly in acting as I did? I think we have to allow that there are cases in which a right may be infringed without being violated. That is, cases in which one does a thing another has a right he won't do, and yet in which he doesn't violate a right, that is, act wrongly. To come back now to the right to life and the right to not be killed, if you kill an aggressor who's aiming at you in a tank, then I don't suppose you have to compensate the man's widow after you've killed him. Perhaps we should say in cases of that kind that the right to not be killed was forfeited. As I said, I'm not happy about this response, but perhaps we should make it. But I do think compensation, or at any rate something like compensation, is owing in the other cases. Of course, you can't compensate a man for the loss of his life, and nothing can compensate his heirs either if they were fond of him. But something by way of apology or amends is owed, for the person killed was innocent. So I think we really should allow that in the second, third, and fourth, the innocent shield, the innocent threat, and the trade-off case, a right was infringed, and thus that the victims did have a right to not be killed, though that right was only infringed and not violated. In short, to sum up here, I think we should grant that the right to not be killed is in the right to life cluster. And thus that the right to life, to have a right to life, is to have, among other rights, the right to not be killed. I hope it's quite clear, however, that to say that, and to say also that every human being, or at any rate every innocent human being, has a right to life, is by no means to say, to be committed to saying, that an innocent human being cannot be killed. You can say both that everyone has a right to life, and yet that human beings may, in certain kinds of cases, be killed, and killed permissibly. I've talked so far only about one of the negative rights in the right to life cluster, and there are surely others. I thought I wouldn't go on to spend time on others of the negative rights in the right to life cluster. What I thought we should just briefly take a look at is the question whether there are any positive rights in the right to life cluster. You'll remember that to have a positive right is to have a right to have something done. A negative right was a right to not have something done. Now, is there a positive right in the right to life cluster? The most commonly proposed candidate, and I'm sure you've heard this proposal, is that there is one. To have a right to life, a number of people say, is to have, among other things, the right to be provided with what one needs for life. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care, whatever it may be that's needed for life. If everyone who has a right to life has this right, the right to be provided with what's needed for life by virtue of having a right to life, then, as you can see, we have a duty to provide aid to those who need it for life, both at home and abroad. And a duty whose source is the right to life itself. I am myself rather suspicious of the idea that there is such a positive right in the right to life cluster. It isn't that I don't think we ought to provide aid, and indeed more aid than we in fact do. I think we ought to. I'm suspicious only of the idea that that aid is owed, that others have a complaint of violation of a right if it's not provided. It's hard to see, however, what the arguments might be either for or against the proposal. I'm not going to try to propose a thesis about that candidate positive right. I'm sorry I haven't got one. The issue that we've been dealing with, that is, what precisely is the content of the right to life, seems to me to be a very difficult one. We Americans have been saying to ourselves and to the rest of the world for 200 years that all men have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I take it there isn't anybody who doesn't recognize that phrase. And it isn't at all clear what even the first of these rights consists in. I don't for a moment suggest we should stop saying this until these theoretical problems I've been drawing attention to get cleared up. But I do suggest that we should all look with a very chilly eye on quick arguments which proceed from the premise that all human beings do have these rights, in particular a right to life, proceed from that premise very quickly to quite specific conclusions about abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment, or more generally about what we may or may not or must not do in this or that specific case in which we find ourselves morally puzzled. The absence of a link between premise and conclusion in those quick arguments, I think, I hope, will strike all of us. Okay.
We'll go right into a discussion. Anyone with a question or a comment? Over here.
I found your analysis delightful and very lucid, and your examples were both amusing, stimulating, and I thought to the point.
But I knew there was going to be another clause.
Minor but is, for a minute there were two examples that I didn't think I followed, and I thought you handled them in the case in terms of infringement and violation. And to check that out, can I ask you a variation of one of your cases? In the surgeon case, where you had 5 people and then the one donor unwilling. Let me change the case just a bit and make a sub-case of a trolley one. The surgeon says this: I have 2 people with 2 bad lungs, 2 people with 2 bad kidneys, each 2. I have 1 person with 1 bad heart, 5 fatalities. Is it an infringement or a violation for the surgeon to cut off the person with the bad heart, thereby sacrificing 1 for 4?
I think that's very nice. That's another nice case. I wanted a 1 to 5 trade-off that was permissible and a 1 to 5 trade-off that's not. Now, what you nicely do is to say, Thomson, you better get additional detail into one of your cases or else it won't really be a 1 to 5 trade-off. So let me add the additional detail that you bring home ought to get added. Let me imagine about my case that we got these 5 people, 2 need lungs, 2 need kidneys, 1 needs a heart, and let's imagine that you can't cut one of them up to provide parts for the others. You can't cut up if you cut the fellow with a heart, he's going downhill, you cut him up and his parts won't catch in the right way. Your case is nice. It's that it isn't structurally similar to my trade-off case in which you can go ahead. And I wanted a case in which there's a 5 to 1 in which you can't, and a case in which there's a 5 to 1 in which you can. I like your case. The analog for the trolley case, here's the analog for the trolley case. You've got, in your case, see, we have my pair of analogs. You've got a case in which you've got 5 sick and you want to cut one of the 5 up to save the other 4. Trolley analog. You've got a trolley speeding toward 5. If you do nothing, all 5 will die. But you could pick one of them up bodily and hurl him at the trolley, stopping the trolley and saving the other 4. The thing is, I don't think you can do that. I'd have thought in your case maybe the doctor can go ahead, but I don't think on it. We pick up, or maybe you think you can. My intuition, could you, there are the 5, they're under threat, can you pick one of them up and throw him bodily at the trolley to stop it? Feels funny to me. On the other hand, let's remember, if you do nothing, he's going to die anyway. He's going to die whether you act or not. So you might feel maybe you can. But I think it's nice what your case brought out was that there are variants here, and I should have stressed that the case I wanted has got to be a 5 for 1. There's no way of getting the gain without.
I thought that was clear. I was trying to change the model.
But
Wouldn't
I
you-
like that.
Wouldn't you pick up the lightest person and throw him? Isn't that the answer?
The nice thing is that, you can map these trade-off cases onto, all of them onto trolley cases, literally trolley cases. I mean, we've got Mrs. Foot's original case. There's the trolley aiming at 5, and you can turn it on to 1. And I think everybody says you can go ahead. Some of my students say even more strongly that you must go ahead. I don't know if you must, but it seems to me you can. Now let's have another trolley case that's more like the doctor case, in which you can't go ahead. There's a trolley speeding toward 5, and you're up on a little footpath over the track. And you know that there's a way to stop that trolley, to keep it from ramming into the 5. You've got to drop a heavy weight in front of it. Now you're up there on the bridge and there's no heavy weight in sight other than a very fat man who's watching the trolley. The only sufficiently heavy weight is the fat man. Can you push him off the bridge into the path of the trolley? Here I think, flat out no, it'd be like cutting somebody up. The doctor case maps into the trolley with the fat man to be pushed off the bridge. You can't do it.
But it really doesn't, I thought, because each one of the people were automatically going to die, whereas the fat man never would.
Sorry, I meant my initial, my doctor case, my initial doctor case, 5 will die and you can cut this bystander up, maps on to 5 workmen will die and you can throw the fat man onto the bridge, onto the track to stop the trolley. Neither case can you go ahead, but you can turn that trolley onto 1. Why in the one trade-off case can you go ahead and in the other not? I think that's one of the prettiest going problems in ethics. Yeah.